Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Today, we're going deep into the Urantia book,
Okay.
specifically Paper 69, to unearth the surprisingly practical origins of human institutions.
Now I know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Institutions. Sounds a bit dry, right? But trust me.
This is fascinating stuff.
We're talking about the roots of industry, capital, even that love-hate relationship we have with money days.
It's easy to forget that these structures we often take for granted, emerged from very human needs and anxieties.
Right.
It wasn't some grand plan,
Yeah.
but rather a series of adaptations and innovations driven by very relatable desires.
Exactly. Take the dawn of industry, for example.
You might picture some early Edison toiling away in a prehistoric workshop.
Right.
But the truth is far more basic.
It was all about avoiding starvation.
Precisely, early humans, just like many animals, experienced that feast or famine cycle of nature.
Those who figured out ways to store food gained a survival advantage.
This wasn't about innovation for innovation's sake.
Right.
It was about adapting to survive.
And here's where it gets interesting. The Urantia book points out that hard work wasn't exactly our natural state.
Right.
It was a necessity.
Driven by that constant struggle for survival, not some innate desire to punch a time clock.
And as living standards gradually rose, that desire for a less precarious existence also fueled that engine of industry.
It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about striving for something more.
It makes you think about the whole rise and grind mentality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe we're not all that different from those early humans dragging ourselves out of bed every morning, driven by a primal need to secure our next meal or...
You know that promotion to afford those fancy groceries?
It's a fascinating parallel.
Now, while many early cultures embraced this concept of hard work,
there were exceptions. The Urantia book highlights a fascinating contrast with the early Hebrews,
who placed a significant emphasis on the value of labor.
Oh, right. He who does not work, neither shall he eat.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially when you contrast it with the prevailing attitudes of the time.
Absolutely. This pro-work ethic set the Hebrews apart.
Many other religions and cultures think of the Greek gods always caught up in some drama.
Right.
Or even Buddha, a figure of contemplation and...
Yes, yeah. Leisure, lean towards a more...
shall we say relaxed approach to work.
Makes you wonder if those early Hebrews were onto something.
Right. But maybe we should save that philosophical debate for another time. So we've got industry up and running, which naturally leads us to capital.
You'd think it'd be all about ambition, right?
Right.
But the Urantia book throws us a curveball,
outlining 8 fascinating drivers of capital accumulation, and some are pretty unexpected.
What's fascinating is that the text presents capital as this double-edged sword.
A tool that can liberate, but also creates new complexities.
Yeah, okay.
It's not just about greed, though, that certainly plays a role.
It's about security, power, and even some very human anxieties.
Okay, you have to give me an example. Some of those drivers listed in the book are...
let's just say they're not your typical economics lecture material.
For instance, the fear of ghosts.
Our ancestors were so concerned with securing a good afterlife that they'd pay priests essentially investing in their post-life comfort.
Okay, I have to admit that's not what I expected.
But when you put it like that, it's not all that different from how people today invest in things like retirement funds or life insurance.
Right.
It's about easing anxieties about the future, even if that future is in the afterlife.
Precisely. And then there's the desire to show off.
A driver of capital accumulation that's as old as time itself.
Imagine amassing a fortune just to burn it for prestige.
Yeah.
Ancient influencers, anyone.
Okay, that's a flex for the history books. But again, you can see how that desire for status, for that external validation, still resonates today.
Oh, yeah.
Think about those over-the-top social media posts flaunting luxury purchases.
It's that same impulse, just with better lighting and filters.
Absolutely.
But let's move on from prehistoric influencers to another fascinating element, fire.
We've talked about surviving famine, but this discovery was just as crucial for our development.
The Urantia book calls fire the basic human invention or discovery. And for good reason.
It quite literally separated us from the animals offering protection from predators at night.
Right. And think about it, fire was probably the earliest form of altruism.
Sharing those live coals without any loss to yourself is such a simple yet profound concept.
And from that simple act of sharing fire, so much emerged. That glowing ember gave rise to the family hearth, a center of early education and storytelling. It's no wonder we still feel drawn to a campfire.
Right.
It's a primal instinct, a reminder of those early connections forged in the warmth and light of fire.
It's like a direct line back to our ancestors huddled around those flickering flames, sharing stories and probably roasting some questionable prehistoric snacks.
Yeah.
But fire wasn't just about warmth and light, right? I mean, it also played a role in shaping our beliefs.
Absolutely. Fire myths, fire worship rituals like passing through fire, these all speak to the profound impact fire had on the human psyche. It is a powerful force, both literally and symbolically. And it's fascinating to see how those early encounters with fire manifested in cultural and spiritual practices.
Speaking of powerful forces, let's talk about another pivotal moment in human history, the domestication of animals. It's easy to take for granted, but it was a game changer for our ancestors.
It really was. Imagine a world where your food source could just run away.
Oh, yeah.
Domestication brought a level of stability and predictability that was previously unimaginable. The Urantia book mentions bison hunting, specifically how early humans learned to corral these animals for easier killing.
Right.
It's not hard to imagine how that eventually evolved into, hey, maybe we can keep them around and skip the whole hunting part altogether.
Talk about a light bulb moment. But as with many innovations, the domestication of animals had its downsides, especially for women.
Sadly, yes. The text points out that as we began herding animals, the treatment of women in many tribes deteriorated. They were often seen as possessions, much like the animals they helped to tend.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, and even those advancements that seem positive can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And this ties into our earlier discussion about slavery. The Urantia book presents it as a stage in social evolution, a step up from practices like cannibalism.
So it was seen as a more merciful, if you can even call it, that alternative to slaughtering captives. Still a horrific practice, of course. But you're saying that even slavery, as awful as it was, played a role in pushing society forward.
It's a difficult concept to grapple with, but the text argues that the need to manage large enslaved populations forced societies to create more complex governing structures. It's this strange paradox. Slavery, driven by brutality and oppression, also contributed to the development of more sophisticated social organizations.
Talk about unintended consequences. But as societies grew more complex, so did their understanding of property right. Earlier, we talked about how early humans weren't exactly idealistic communists, but that communal living eventually gave way to the concept of private property.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how the concept of ownership was initially tied to deeply personal, almost spiritual beliefs. Early humans believed that objects held a piece of their owner's personality, so stealing within a tribe was almost unthinkable.
Wow, that puts a whole new spin on the whole finders keepers thing.
Right, your sleeping spot was sacred, and any place where you shed blood, well, that became your territory. These were serious boundaries backed by a deep respect for personal space and belongings.
So fast forward a bit, and we're laying claim to water holes, then entire fields. Was this when things started shifting from a communal approach to something more hierarchical?
You're spot on. As societies became more agricultural, the concept of land as a source of individual wealth took hold. We start seeing life tenureships, then inheritance, and boom, land becomes capital.
Cue the dramatic music. And thus, landlords were born.
Okay, I'm being a bit facetious, but it is fascinating to see how these ancient concepts of ownership still resonate in our modern world.
And it's crucial to remember that this wasn't some linear, inevitable march toward private ownership. The Urantia book makes it clear that this shift happened because communal control wasn't working. So it wasn't necessarily about greed, but rather a solution to a very real problem. That makes sense. But as we've seen, solutions often come with their own sets of new problems.
Sadly, that's often the case. And the text doesn't shy away from acknowledging the downsides of private property. It led to social stratification with slaves, serfs, and landless classes.
It's a sobering reminder that progress isn't always pretty. It's messy, it's complicated, and often comes at a cost. But speaking of messy and complicated, let's talk about marriage.
Yes, the evolution from polygamy to monogamy is particularly fascinating, especially as the text frames it as directly related to the concepts of ownership and, unfortunately, slavery.
So are you saying that early marriage was basically just another form of property exchange?
In many ways, yes. Early on, women were considered the property of the tribe with the chief controlling marriages. Men accumulated wives much like they did livestock. It wasn't exactly a recipe for romance.
Okay, so how did we get from that to, like, sharing a Netflix account and arguing over the thermostat with our significant others?
Well, the Urantia book attributes this shift to the decline of communal living and the rise of the individual household.
Yeah.
As men gained more control over their property, including women, the family unit as we know it today began to emerge, and with it the concept of monogamy.
because having multiple wives was a logistical nightmare.
I can only imagine the family dramas.
Precisely. But beyond the practicality, the text also hints at a more idealistic shift, describing monogamy as the slave-free ideal of the matchless association of one man and one woman. It's a recognition of that deep, exclusive partnership that humans crave.
That's a pretty poetic way to describe a system that, let's be honest, probably caused its fair share of ancient arguments and headaches. But it's interesting to see how even something as fundamental as marriage was shaped by these larger social and economic forces. So we've journeyed from those early struggles for survival to the complex dance of ownership, power, and even love, all shaped by forces both practical and, dare I say, a little bit spiritual.
It's quite a story, isn't it? And the Urantia book doesn't just leave us there contemplating the origins of these institutions.
Right. It goes a step further, hinting at where we might go from here.
The text talks about achieving a higher social order, but it's careful not to offer any easy answers. It reminds us that what we have now, for all its flaws, is still a vast improvement over the systems of the past. Progress isn't always about tearing down the old. It's about building upon it, carefully and thoughtfully.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, right? Except in this case, it's more like those who don't understand the past might accidentally stumble backward while trying to move forward.
Exactly. We need to be mindful of those missteps, those seemingly quick fixes that could actually set us back. The Urantia book specifically warns against clinging to outdated formulas just because they're familiar.
It's a call for progress that's both informed and compassionate, not just change for the sake of change, right?
Precisely. And perhaps even more importantly, it encourages us to question our assumptions. We tend to think of human institutions as just that, human creations. But this deep dive suggests they might be even more deeply rooted in our shared history than we realize.
It's like we're carrying the echoes of those early struggles and triumphs within us, even today, which leads to a pretty mind-boggling question. If our ancestors could see us now, what would they make of it all?
Wouldn't that be fascinating to see? Would they marvel at our technological advancements or be horrified by our complex social structures? Would they recognize those primal fears and desires that still drive us or see us as utterly alien?
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that's the beauty of a deep dive like this. It's not just about unearthing the past. It's about understanding ourselves and our place in this grand, messy, constantly evolving story a little bit better.
And hopefully it inspires us to approach the future with a bit more wisdom, a bit more compassion, and maybe even a healthy dose of humility. After all, we're just the latest chapter in a story that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the surprising origins of everything and anything. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep on diving deep.